There are places that are not born cursed. They learn. This story will surprise you in a way you never imagined. Stay until the end to witness this insane story. They learn from what was done there, from what was hidden, from what was never given a name, from what rotted without witnesses. Places like this do not scream. They observe, they wait, and when they finally decide to act, they do not do so all at once. They prefer slow wear, the silent erosion of sanity, fear that grows like mold on the walls of the mind. The road that led to Cold Stone Valley was one of those forgotten scars on the map. An old stretch, poorly maintained, bordered by trees that were too tall, too dense, too close. During the day it already caused discomfort. At night, it became a tunnel of shadows that seemed to move with a life of its own, as if the forest breathed in unison, exhaling a damp, heavy air, laden with something that was not just the smell of wet earth. The car moved forward slowly, headlights cutting through the darkness in pale bands that revealed twisted trunks, broken branches, ancient marks on the asphalt that looked more like scratches than cracks. Inside the vehicle, the silence was almost absolute, interrupted only by the low hum of the engine and the slight creak of the suspension at every imperfection in the road. Lucas felt the discomfort long before seeing any sign. It was not declared fear. Not yet. It was that uneasy feeling, difficult to explain, as if something were out of place even before being consciously perceived. A tightness in the chest, a constant tension in the shoulders, the impression of being watched, even with the windows closed, even without any visible sign of presence. In the passenger seat, Mariana kept her arms crossed, staring fixedly at the road ahead. She did not speak. She did not complain. But her rigid jaw and the fingers pressing into her own forearm revealed that she felt the same. In the back seat, Vinicius and Helena tried to disguise their nervousness with trivial comments, laughing too loudly, as if the sound of their own voices could drive away the growing sensation that this trip had been a mistake. They should not have been there. Everyone knew it. The invitation had appeared weeks earlier, almost like a joke. A weekend retreat. An old isolated house, rented for an absurdly low price. A perfect place to rest, disconnect, produce content, record stories, photograph, explore. The kind of proposal that, at first glance, seemed too good to be refused, and, for that very reason, should have been. Cold Stone Valley did not appear easily in common searches. It was necessary to go beyond the first pages, click through old forums, deleted comments, broken links. When it did appear, it always came accompanied by vague phrases, warnings disguised as exaggeration, confused reports that mixed superstition, ancient tragedies, and poorly explained disappearances. Nothing concrete enough to prevent the decision. The sign appeared suddenly, illuminated by the headlights. Aged wood, letters almost erased by time, moss spreading along the edges. Cold Stone Valley. Below, in smaller letters, there was something almost illegible, as if someone had tried to erase it by force. Lucas slowed down even more. The moment they passed the sign, the radio turned off by itself. There was no abrupt crack, no static. The sound simply died, as if it had been sucked out of the car. Vinicius complained, fiddled with the knob, lightly tapped the dashboard. Nothing. The display remained lit, but emitted no sound. Strange, he murmured, trying to laugh. Must be weak signal. But no one answered. The air felt different there, colder, denser. Each breath seemed to require more effort, as if the lungs had to work against something invisible. The trees closed in over the road, forming a natural arch that blocked the sky. There was no visible moon. There were no stars, only a ceiling of continuous darkness. When they finally caught sight of the house, none of them said anything. It was not exactly frightening at first glance, not in the obvious sense. There were no towers, broken windows, nor that common Gothic exaggeration found in horror stories. It was an old construction of dark stone, solid, heavy, as if it had been torn from the very earth. The walls were thick, irregular, marked by time. The slanted roof seemed to support a weight that did not come only from rain or years. The house did not seem abandoned. It seemed waiting. The exterior lights were off. No sound came from inside. No insect buzzed around. No animal moved nearby. The silence there was not natural. It was too complete, too artificial. Lucas parked. The engine shut off. The silence became absolute. It was at that moment that Helena felt it. A chill ran up her spine, slow, almost gentle, like icy fingers tracing a deliberate path. She had the strange impression that the place recognized her, as if it knew who she was, as if it had been waiting specifically for them. When they stepped out of the car, the cold intensified. The ground beneath their feet seemed harder than it should have been, almost vibrating imperceptibly. The door of the house was unlocked. Mariana hesitated before pushing it open. As the wood creaked, an ancient smell escaped from the interior. It was not ordinary mold. It was something deeper. Damp earth, cold stone, something metallic, distant, almost imperceptible, that made the stomach churn without a clear explanation. The door opened completely, revealing a long corridor, poorly lit by a single weak bulb on the ceiling. The stone walls absorbed the little light, creating dense shadows that seemed to move as they breathed. The floor creaked under every step, even though it was stone, as if there were something hollow beneath the structure. When the last person entered, the door closed by itself behind them. Not violently, not forcefully, it simply closed. And in that instant, without any of them consciously realizing it, something was sealed. Something ancient, something hungry. Something that should never have been awakened. Cold Stone Valley had accepted their presence, and it had no intention whatsoever of letting them leave unscathed, as if it had been ripped out of the natural sequence of things. Mariana felt an intense cold at that moment. Not a common physical cold, but something that seemed to arise from within, as if her bones were being exposed to a hostile environment. She stood up and decided to explore more of the house, perhaps to distract herself from the growing sensation that something was watching them. At the far end of the main corridor, there was a door that none of them remembered having seen before. It was low, almost hidden, made of dark wood reinforced with rusted metal bars. There was no ordinary doorknob, only an iron ring embedded in it, cold to the touch. The moment Mariana touched the ring, a sound traveled through the entire house. It was not loud, it was not violent. It was a deep groan, coming from below, as if something had been pressed after remaining immobile for a very long time. The walls vibrated slightly. The floor seemed to respond with an almost imperceptible tremor. Helena felt her stomach churn. Lucas told Mariana to let go of it. She obeyed immediately. The sound ceased. The silence returned, heavier than before. That was when the first distortions began. Vinicius came down the stairs pale, saying he had seen someone in the corridor upstairs. Not a clear figure, just the sensation of presence, a movement in the corner of his eye. When he turned to look directly, there was no one. The doors, however, were open in a different way. Some that had been closed were now ajar. Others seemed to have changed places, as if the corridor had been reorganized. Lucas tried to rationalize it. He said old houses were strange, that the mind played tricks in the dark, but as he spoke, he had the distinct impression that someone whispered very close to his left ear. Not words, just a warm, damp breath, carrying a metallic smell. He stopped speaking abruptly. Helena began to hear voices. At first they sounded like a distant murmur, mixed with a wind that did not exist. Then they began to take shape. They were not unfamiliar voices. They were far too familiar. They were the voices of people she knew, people who were not there. They called her name softly, almost affectionately, as if they wanted to reassure her. She covered her ears. The sound did not stop. Mariana, in turn, began to notice marks on the walls that had not been there before. Symbols deeply scratched into the stone, almost hidden by the dim lighting. They were not clear drawings. They looked more like claw marks repeated countless times, as if someone had tried to leave a warning and failed. When Lucas ran his hand over one of them, he felt something wrong. The stone was warm. Too warm. It was at that moment that the house reacted. All the doors closed at the same time, not violently, not with impact. They simply closed. And in the absolute silence that followed, a certainty slowly settled into the mind of each of them, heavy as an inevitable sentence. That was not just an old house. It was not just a strange place. It was a space that remembered, that observed, that was beginning, little by little, to manifest. and whatever was awakening inside was not interested in frightening them so that they would flee. It was interested in something far deeper. The silence that followed the closing of the doors was not merely the absence of sound. It was an active, oppressive silence, one that pressed against the ears and caused the heart to beat irregularly, as if the body itself were trying to adjust to a new logic. Lucas was the first to move, walking to the front door and twisting the handle with force. Nothing. He tried again, now with more urgency. The wood did not give even a millimeter. There was no visible lock. There was no mechanism at all. Still, the door remained closed, solid, definitive. Mariana tried the windows once more, all of them immobile. It was not as if they were simply jammed. They seemed to be part of the wall, fused into the structure, like blind eyes that refused to open. Vinicius slammed the wood with the palm of his hand, then with his shoulder, and the sound echoed strangely, muffled, as if the house absorbed the impact with silent pleasure. It was Helena who first realized that the air had changed yet again. The cold now did not come only from the environment. It came from the floor, the walls, the ceiling, as if the entire house were exhaling an impossible temperature, slowly draining the heat from their bodies. She felt a sharp stab in her head, followed by sudden vertigo, and had to lean against the table to keep from falling. Images began to surface in her mind without warning. They were not her memories. They were disconnected fragments, scenes too fast to be immediately understood. People running across a dark field, lanterns shaking, screams muffled by the earth, hands covered in mud trying to reach the air before being pulled down again. Helena covered her mouth, gagging on a metallic taste that appeared suddenly as if she had bitten her own tongue, though there was no blood. She tried to speak, but the words would not come out. Lucas noticed her condition and approached, asking if she was all right. The moment he touched her shoulder, the vision changed. Now it was not only Helena who saw. Lucas felt it too. A shock went through his body, an icy discharge that ran down his spine and exploded behind his eyes. He saw the same field, the same moonless night, the same desperate haste. He saw men with tense faces, holding shovels and ropes. He saw graves being dug in a hurry. He saw bodies being thrown into them, some still moving. Lucas stumbled backward, gasping. Vinicius and Mariana watched the scene, confused, until the floor vibrated lightly beneath their feet. A deep, distant sound echoed inside the walls, like a prolonged lament rising from the foundations of the house. That sound was not produced by anything physical. It was pure emotion, condensed pain, ancient fear. That was when they found the first record. In one of the side rooms, behind a bookcase they did not remember seeing before, there was a narrow door leading to a small chamber. Inside, resting on a stone table, lay a thick book, covered in dust and dark stains that did not look like mere dampness. The cover had no title, only a symbol carved deeply into it, the same irregular pattern Mariana had seen scratched into the walls. When they opened the book, the smell intensified. It was not just old paper. It was the smell of something that had been touched by dirty hands, by fear, by desperation. The pages were filled with uneven writing, sometimes organized, sometimes chaotic, as if different people had contributed to it over time. Dates appeared frequently but did not follow any logical order. Some were crossed out. Others were repeated countless times. They began to read. Coldstone Valley was not merely a geographic name. It was a place used for decades as a dumping ground. Unwanted people, outsiders, the sick, those no one would claim. During times of epidemics, crises, and collective fear, the valley had served as a silent solution. There were no official records. There were no marked graves, only shallow pits, opened and closed on the same night. The house had been built later, not as a common residence, but as a marker, a seal, a desperate attempt to contain something that had been awakened there. The book mentioned incomplete rituals, failed attempts at purification, symbolic sacrifices that were never enough. It spoke of a presence that had no name, described only as that which listens when no one is looking. As they read, the manifestations intensified. Whispers began to grow clearer, now forming incomplete words, broken phrases, pleas for help mixed with accusation. Vinicius heard someone calling for his mother. Mariana heard a child's voice asking why it was dark. Lucas felt invisible hands touch his back, gently pushing him toward the table. Helena fell to her knees. The images returned, now sharper. She saw the exact moment the first mistake was made. People buried alive, not out of deliberate cruelty, but out of haste, fear of contagion, convenience. She saw earth being thrown over bodies that still breathed. She saw fingernails breaking against improvised wooden boards. She heard promises being made in the dark, promises of vengeance, promises of unrest. When Helena raised her face, her eyes were full of tears, but her gaze was strange, too distant. "The house does not trap," she said, in a voice that did not seem entirely her own. "It selects." The ground trembled again, stronger this time. A crack appeared in the nearby wall, opening slowly, revealing something that should not have existed there. A spiral corridor descending far too deep, far too dark, exhaling an air even colder, even heavier. The book fell from the table by itself, opening on a page marked with repeated symbols. It stated that the presence needed witnesses. It needed conscious bodies. It needed someone to remember. The house was not the evil itself. It was only the container. The true horror was buried below. No one needed to say out loud that they should not go down. The spiral staircase opened in the wall did not invite. It demanded. The air rising from that opening was colder, heavier, laden with the ancient smell of disturbed earth and rust, as if time itself were rotting down there. The sound coming from below was not exactly a noise, but a constant pressure, a low hum that vibrated in the bones and made their teeth grind without them realizing it. Lucas tried to step away, to take a step back, but felt his heel hit something solid. He looked. The wall was there, smooth, continuous, as if the room had discreetly reorganized itself. There was no longer any space to retreat. The house guided them with cruel gentleness, eliminating options while maintaining the illusion of choice. Mariana was the first to descend. Not out of courage, but out of necessity. The weight on her chest had become unbearable, an anxiety that only lessened when she moved closer to the opening. Each step seemed to drain a little more of her strength, not physical strength, but mental, as if memories that were not hers were being torn away and replaced older, darker ones. Vinicius followed right behind, holding his phone, the flashlight trembling so much that the beam danced along the walls, revealing deep claw marks. Inscriptions repeated to exhaustion, words layered over one another in desperate overlap. Helena descended last, murmuring disconnected phrases. Sometimes they sounded like prayers. Other times, like answers to questions no one had asked. Lucas tried to call her name, but she did not react. Her eyes were glassy, fixed on something that seemed to move beyond the darkness, something only she could see. The farther they descended, the more the sense of space unraveled. The staircase seemed endless. Time stretched, compressed between steps that always felt the same. Vinicius's phone began to fail, the light flickering, dimming, until it went out completely. Darkness became absolute for an instant that lasted far too long. It was then that they heard the first scream. It did not come from far away. It came from within. Mariana felt a sudden pain in her head, as if something had been forced violently into her mind. She saw, not as a distant observer, but as a participant. She felt the earth pressing against her chest, the lack of air, the absolute panic of realizing no one was coming. She felt fingernails breaking, her throat burning from screaming without sound. When she collapsed to her knees, she vomited, her body convulsing as images continued to overlap without mercy. Vinicius tried to help her, but something grabbed his ankle. Not a visible hand, but a sudden, determined force that sent him crashing down violently. He hit his head against the stone, and for a second, everything went too silent. When he opened his eyes, he was alone. There was no staircase. There was no house. There was an open field under a starless black sky. Lanterns moved in the distance. People ran. Someone screamed his name, but the voice came from a mouth that was not familiar, distorted, ancient. Vinicius tried to run, but his feet sank into the wet, heavy earth, which seemed to close around his legs with hunger. In the world above, Lucas screamed for him, shaking the empty air where Vinicius had been seconds before. There was no transition. There was no explanation. He simply ceased to exist there. The space he had occupied closed like water after a dive, and the staircase continued, indifferent. Despair began to erode any attempt at rationality. Lucas now felt voices whispering his name in chorus, not in direct threat, but in recognition, as if he were being accepted, as if he had always belonged to that place. The walls pulsed faintly, a slow, steady rhythm that resembled a gigantic heart buried beneath layers of stone and earth. Helena suddenly stopped. She turned her face toward Lucas and Mariana, and for an instant, she seemed lucid. Her eyes filled with genuine fear, not of what was happening, but of what she knew was still to come. When she spoke, her voice came out doubled, overlapped by a deep echo, as if something else spoke through her. "He woke up," she said, "and he is hungry." The ground opened. It was not a simple crack. It was a deliberate opening, like a mouth yawning wide. Mariana slipped first. She tried to hold on, but felt her fingers lose strength as if something were draining her energy. Lucas tried to grab her, felt her skin cold, slick, and then she was ripped from his hands by an impossible force. Her scream did not end. It echoed downward, mixed with dozens of others that seemed to rise together, forming an endless chorus of pain and terror. Lucas was left alone with Helena, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. He tried to run, but the staircase no longer existed in the same way. The steps twisted, merged, changed places. Helena began to laugh. Not a laugh of joy, but of understanding. She approached Lucas slowly, each step accompanied by a dry crack coming from deep within the earth. When she touched his face, her hand was far too cold, far too rigid. "Someone has to stay," she said softly. "Someone always stays." The walls began to close in. The space shrank, compressing the air, forcing Lucas to breathe too fast, to think too fast. It was then that he realized the cruel truth behind the book, the symbols, the house. This was not about simple vengeance. It was not about punishment. It was a cycle, an ancient mechanism that required continuity, presence, a conscious human presence to keep what was buried there contained, fed, awakened, and at the same time, trapped. Helena was not merely a victim. She had been chosen, and now Lucas was beginning to understand that perhaps he had been as well. The space around Lucas ceased to obey any known logic. The walls, once solid, now seemed to breathe, swelling and contracting in a slow, organic rhythm, obscenely alive. The air was too heavy for his lungs. Every breath required conscious effort, as if something invisible pressed against his chest from the inside out. The absence of light did not mean total darkness. There was a diffuse reddish glow pulsing from somewhere below, like a reflection of something that should never be seen directly. Helena walked ahead, guided not by sight but by certainty. Her steps were firm, deliberate, as if she had always known that path. Lucas tried to call her again, but the name died in his throat. Words seemed to lose meaning there. Sounds did not propagate the same way. Everything was absorbed, diluted, as if reality itself were tired of maintaining coherence. They reached a space far too large to exist beneath a house. The floor was packed earth, marked by deep grooves, as if something enormous had dragged itself across it repeatedly over decades. Around them, stone walls rose in irregular circles, covered in layered symbols, written with dried blood, fingernails, bones, anything capable of marking the surface. There was no visible ceiling. Above them, only pulsing darkness. At the center of that space, there was something. Not a creature in the common sense. Not a defined body with a clear shape. It was a condensed presence. An accumulation of pain, fear, and fragmented consciousness. It looked like a mass of thick shadows intertwined with something resembling roots, nerves, exposed veins pulsing slowly. At times, it assumed vaguely human contours. Faces surfaced and vanished across its surface, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide, begging for something that never came. Lucas collapsed to his knees without realizing when his legs lost strength. The weight of that presence was not only physical, it was emotional, psychological, crushing. Every negative thought he had ever had, every buried guilt, every memory he had preferred to forget surged forward at once, amplified, distorted, weaponized against him. He felt Mariana's despair, Vinicius's panic, the agony of dozens, hundreds of people who had passed through there before. He felt death not as a final event, but as an endless process. The entity reacted to their presence, not with immediate aggression, but with hungry curiosity. Parts of that mass moved slowly toward Lucas, extending like shadowy tendrils. Where they touched the ground, the earth darkened, rotted, as if matter itself surrendered. Helena stepped even closer, without fear. "He remembers," she said, her voice now completely fused with another, deeper, older one. "He remembers everyone. He remembers every stolen breath, every ignored plea." Lucas tried to scream that this had to end, that it made no sense, that it was not fair. But fairness was a fragile concept there. The entity was not evil by choice. It was the inevitable result of repeated human actions over time. Decisions made in the dark, lives discarded as inconvenient. Images flooded Lucas's mind again, now without any filter. He saw the construction of the house, built over still fresh graves. He saw improvised rituals, people trying to contain something they did not fully understand. He saw the first time someone was deliberately left there, offered as an anchor, as a living guardian, condemned to hear, feel, and remember, so that the horror would not escape completely. Helena turned toward him. "It was always like this," she said. "The place chooses, those who listen more, those who feel deeper, those who cannot turn away." Lucas understood. She had not been chosen at random. None of them had. The house, the valley, the thing buried beneath it, everything functioned like a cruel filter. It tested limits, pressed internal fractures, observed who broke first, and who endured long enough to serve the final purpose. The entity moved again, now partially enveloping Helena. She did not resist. Her body began to change subtly, its contours becoming less defined, as if she were being absorbed and, at the same time, integrated. Her face contorted in pain and relief simultaneously. "It is not death," she murmured. "It is permanent." Lucas felt something pulling at him too. An invisible force restrained his arms, his legs, his thoughts. He was dragged a few centimeters across the ground, feeling the cold earth against his skin, fear rising in violent waves. He fought. He screamed. He begged. But every resistance only fed the presence even more. That was when he noticed something different. Amid all that condensed pain, there were fissures, small failures, moments when the entity seemed to lose cohesion, as if contradictory memories collided within it. It was not a single being. It was a mass of consciousnesses, held together by force, and that required constant balance. Someone had to sustain that balance. Helena looked at him one last time, real tears running down the face that still remained. "One of us can go," she said, "but the other must stay awake." The choice was not between living or dying. It was between escaping while carrying the weight of all of it forever, or remaining there, conscious, serving as a pillar to keep the horror contained. Lucas felt the entity press harder, as if testing his decision, and then something inside him gave way. Lucas's decision did not come as a heroic act nor as a conscious sacrifice. It came as an internal collapse, a point at which resisting no longer made sense. Fear still existed, intense and suffocating, but something stronger began to form beneath it. The absolute understanding that that place did not accept denial. It did not need to convince them. It did not need to threaten. It only needed to wait until the mind gave in from exhaustion. The world seemed to drift away slowly when Lucas stopped fighting. The pressure on his body lessened in an almost gentle way, as if the entity had recognized the choice even before it was fully formed. The force dragging him ceased. He lay on the cold ground, breathing with difficulty while the immense presence rearranged itself before him, pulsing in a steadier, more controlled rhythm. Helena was still there, partially wrapped in shadows, her face now unnaturally calm, her eyes open, attentive, aware of everything. She smiled sadly. "He accepts," she said, not to Lucas, but to something far deeper. "He always accepts in the end." The entity responded with a sound that was neither voice, nor noise, nor thought. It was an agreement, an ancient understanding being renewed. Lucas felt something connect to his mind, not like a violent intruder, but like a root slowly penetrating, spreading, anchoring itself. Images began to organize inside him, no longer chaotic, but ordered, like files being opened one by one. He saw everything. He saw every person buried in the valley, every silent night when graves were opened in haste, every decision made out of fear or convenience. He felt every last thought, every regret, every useless attempt to scream, not as a distant observer, but as a vessel, as an involuntary guardian of a collective memory that refused to disappear. Helena's body began to dissolve slowly, not in blood or violence, but into fragments of shadow that were absorbed by the entity. Her consciousness, however, did not vanish. Lucas felt when she joined the internal chorus, a distinct presence among many, lucid, awake, condemned to permanence. "Do not forget," her voice echoed within him, now part of that vast and painful mental space. "If you forget, it grows." The house reacted. Above them, walls rearranged themselves, corridors sealed shut. The spiral staircase began to unravel, as if it had never existed. The subterranean space contracted slowly, sealing itself around the entity and its new conscious pillar. The sensation was that of being buried alive, but without earth, without physical weight, only with intact awareness, incapable of escape. Lucas screamed one last time. The sound did not leave him. It was absorbed. When everything finally stabilized, the silence returned. A different silence, no longer hungry, no longer chaotic. A watched silence. Outside, the house in Coldstone Valley remained exactly as it always had. Old, abandoned, silent. Days later, residents of nearby towns spoke about a group of young people who had rented a house in that region and were never seen again. Official searches found nothing, no bodies, no concrete evidence, only an empty house with furniture covered in dust and an unlocked door. Some claimed to hear things at night, spaced footsteps, almost human whispers, a low, constant sound coming from the ground. Months later, a new listing appeared on an obscure rental site. An isolated house. A price far below normal. Perfect for those seeking silence, inspiration, isolation. And deep beneath the earth, below the cold stone, Lucas remained awake. He did not sleep. He did not dream. He did not go completely mad. He remembered for all those who had been forgotten. He remembered so that the entity would not expand beyond the valley. He remembered because someone always had to stay. Someone always had to listen. Someone always had to carry the weight of what had been done there. And as long as someone remembered, the horror would remain contained, but never dead. After all, places like this do not learn in order to forgive. They learn in order to wait. And one day, when memory fails, when the guardian weakens, Coldstone Valley will call again, and someone, somewhere, will answer. Time ceased to exist for Lucas in the way he had once known it. There were no more days, nights, or clear intervals between one thought and another. Everything had become a continuous sequence of perception without rest, as if his mind were permanently awake in a place where sleep was not allowed. He no longer felt his own body as before. There was no hunger, thirst, or physical exhaustion. What remained was something worse, absolute, uninterrupted awareness, with no refuge. The entity did not speak. It did not need to. Communication happened through overlap. Thoughts that were not his infiltrated his mind. Memories that did not belong to his life emerged with unbearable clarity. Lucas began to distinguish internal voices not by sound, but by the pain associated with each memory. Some were brief, almost merciful. Others stretched on for what felt like eternity. He relived countless deaths. He felt the weight of earth crushing the chest of a man who was still breathing. He heard the muffled sobs of a woman trying not to scream, so she would not waste the little air she had left. He experienced the childlike panic of someone who did not understand why they were being left in the dark. Each experience did not come as a distant film, but as a complete immersion. He was every person, every agony, every final thought. And the worst part was not the physical pain. It was the awareness of abandonment. That was what the entity fed on. Not blood, not bodies, but the memory of what no one wanted to carry. The horror was not in killing. It was in forgetting. The valley had become a repository of disposable lives, and now demanded that someone remember for all of them, forever. Lucas realized, with slow and growing terror, that his identity was beginning to dissolve. At first, he could still remember his own name clearly. Later, he had to make an effort. Then the name came mixed with others, as if it were just one among dozens. He began to forget details of his own childhood, the faces of his parents, the sensation of simple things, like the warmth of the sun or the sound of rain. In exchange, he remembered everything he had never wanted to know. At times, the house above reacted. He could feel when someone entered, not through sight, but as a distant vibration, a subtle disturbance in the entity's balance. Curious people, explorers, individuals drawn by the low price, by the isolation, by the sense of mystery. The house received them with the same patient silence as always. Lucas tried to scream to them, tried to push thoughts, images, warning. Sometimes he managed small effects. A flickering light, a sound out of place, a sudden chill. But the house needed enough victims to keep the cycle functioning. It never allowed everyone to escape. Some left disturbed, carrying nightmares they would never be able to explain. Others stayed. As what might have been years or centuries passed, Lucas no longer had any way to measure. He began to feel something new. Fissures, small failures in the entity's structure, moments when memories collided, when voices disagreed, when balance wavered dangerously. In those moments, the valley became more aggressive, more hungry. And in those moments, Lucas was forced to absorb even more pain to stabilize everything again. He was the weight that kept it contained. And the weight was increasing. The entity began to test his limits. Images started repeating more frequently. Memories returned distorted, overlapped, as if they were trying to permanently fuse with his identity. Lucas began to lose track of where his consciousness ended and where the others began. Sometimes he felt the urge to call for someone whose name he did not recognize. Other times he was absolutely certain that he had been there before, buried, suffocating, long before he had been born. The house responded. It began to change faster. People who entered reported corridors that led nowhere, doors that appeared where walls had once been, rooms that seemed larger on the inside than on the outside. Some claimed to hear a man quietly crying beneath the floor, begging them to leave. Others swore they heard a firm, desperate voice trying to warn them of something terrible. Almost no one listened. Lucas then understood the most cruel truth of all. The valley no longer needed just a guardian. It needed replacement. The entity would not allow a pillar to remain conscious forever. The human mind, no matter how resilient, eventually gave in. When that happened, the balance broke, and something far worse than the house would be released. That was why the place called again. That was why new visitors were drawn in. That was why the horror never ceased. Someone had to take the burden when the old guardian began to fail. And Lucas was failing. He felt the first clear sign when he realized he could no longer remember Helena's face without it blending into dozens of others. When he tried to cling to his own guilt, to his own story, and found only hollow echoes. When he realized that, for the first time, he deeply wished that someone else would arrive. That desire terrified him more than anything that had come before, because it meant the valley was winning. And somewhere along the dark road, on some cold night, someone was already on their way to the stone house. The collapse did not happen all at once. It came in layers, like everything in that place. First, Lucas began to lose the ability to distinguish memory from imagination. Then he lost the certainty that he had ever existed outside that subterranean space. The idea of having had a body, of having walked beneath the sky, of having breathed air not saturated with death, became an abstract concept, almost childish. Even so, something in him resisted, a fragile core that refused to vanish completely. It was not hope. It was fear. Fear that if he gave in entirely, what was contained would lose its limits. The entity perceived that resistance. It began to pressure him in subtler, crueler ways. It no longer flooded him only with ancient memories, but with possibilities. It showed futures that would never happen, distortions of lives that could have been lived, alternate versions in which the victims had escaped, only to make them die again in even more brutal ways. Lucas began to feel guilt for things he had never done, regret for choices he had never been given the chance to make. Every emotion was explored to its limit, squeezed until it lost all human meaning. At times, he felt something approaching the boundary of the valley. They were not visitors yet, but echoes. People researching the place, hearing rumors, feeling an inexplicable pull when seeing photos of the house or reading vague descriptions. The entity stirred during those moments, like an animal scenting prey from a distance. The walls of the subterranean space pulsed faster, the internal voices became chaotic, and Lucas was forced to absorb even more to keep everything stable. He began to fail more frequently. There was a night, if it could still be called that, when a group arrived. 3 people, young, too curious for their own good. Lucas felt the moment they crossed the threshold of the house, felt the subtle impact on the structure, like a wave rippling through the earth until it reached him. He tried to gather strength, tried to push clear images, direct warnings, something that would drive them away. He managed only fragments, a sudden chill, an elongated creak, a strong smell of damp earth that made one of them comment that the place didn't feel right. 2 of them wanted to leave, 1 stayed. This was the pattern Lucas began to recognize with growing horror. The house did not need everyone. It never had. It selected with surgical precision, observing reactions, measuring fear, testing emotional limits. Those who felt too much, who thought too deeply, who carried old guilt or deep emptiness, those were the chosen ones. Lucas felt when the chosen one began to descend. The staircase was no longer physical as before. It was a transition, a slide of consciousness. The young man did not scream. He did not run. He simply walked, as if hypnotized, drawn by something that promised answers. When he finally reached the subterranean space, Lucas felt the entity expand in anticipation. The presence of the new visitor was like an electric shock. And with absolute terror, Lucas realized that his mind reacted differently now. Where there had once been revulsion, there was relief. Where there had once been despair, there was rest. For the first time since he had been trapped there, the weight lessened slightly. The entity was testing the replacement. It was evaluating whether that new human being could endure the burden. Lucas tried to resist the sensation, tried to cling to what remained of his identity, but it was already too frayed. Fragments of thoughts escaped without him noticing. Words stopped making sense. Basic human emotions, empathy, compassion, outrage, began to merge with something colder, more functional. He began to understand the valley not as a place of horror, but as a system, and that terrified him. The entity began to divide the weight between them. The new visitor started receiving images, whispers, fragments of memory. Lucas felt when the young man fell to his knees, felt the panic, the confusion, the denial. And along with it, he felt something loosen inside, an ancient thread, finally snapping. It was then that Lucas understood the final fate of all guardians. They did not die. They dissolved. Over time, their consciousnesses were fragmented, distributed between the entity and the next human pillar, until nothing remained that could be called self. Only function, only vigilance, only raw memory. At that stage, the entity no longer needed to be cruel. The process happened almost naturally, like erosion. Lucas felt parts of himself fade, the sound of his own voice, the sensation of having a name, the exact memory of why all of this had once terrified him so deeply. In exchange, he felt a broader, colder, more distant understanding. He began to see the valley for what it truly was. Not a monster, but a repository, a place where humanity hid what it did not want to face, where collective fear condensed until it gained awareness, where forgetting took root. The house above would continue calling, people would continue arriving, and there would always be someone to stay. The last genuinely human thing Lucas felt was a desperate impulse to break the cycle. For one brief, nearly non-existent instant, he tried to concentrate everything that remained of himself into a single thought, a single message, something that could escape that place and reach the outside world as a final warning. It did not work. The entity absorbed even that. When the new guardian finally took over completely, Lucas was no longer there as an individual. Only a faint echo remained, a residue of consciousness diluted among thousands. Even so, somewhere deep within, something persisted, like a noise impossible to eliminate completely. And it was that noise that sometimes more sensitive visitors perceived, an unease with no explanation, a sudden urge to leave, a sensation that the place did not want to be forgotten. But almost no one listened, because the true horror of Cold Stone Valley was never death, nor the entity, nor the house that moved in the dark. It was the infinite capacity of the place to continue existing. And as long as someone crossed that door, as long as someone ignored the silent warning, as long as the world preferred to forget, the valley would continue to learn. If you enjoy horror stories, subscribe to my channel and activate the notification bell to receive all the stories and not miss a single one, with access to new videos every week, filled with mystery and suspense.